Well, again, I work for the Ray, an exciting organization and place here in the state of Georgia. And last night, my colleague Ioana spoke about some exciting roadside solar projects and tools. And tonight, I want to talk more about the landscape and the right of way, this corridor, this space that I believe is often forgotten. But I can't start without talking about the Ray, and I apologize if you tuned in yesterday. This will be some of the same, but our story begins with Ray Anderson. He was the founder and CEO of Interface, the world's leader in designing and manufacturing carpet tiles. He's a Georgian native who risked his family's entire savings to start Interface in the 1970s. And from that dream, he grew it to $1 billion global industry by the 90s. But then he risked it all because he knew he could do better, that we can all do better. Ray had an epiphany. He writes about it and has spoken about it, that a spear to the chest moment, that all the petroleum that made his carpet tiles would ultimately end up in a landfill. And he challenged Interface to go zero. And he meant it. Zero landfill, zero carbon, zero fossil fuels. And he, in doing that, ended up saving his company $400 million. But what he did for the world is he proved that you can do well by doing good. Because in the 90s, when he brought this forward within Interface, it wasn't as well accepted as we talk about it today. Circular economies, corporate sustainability is mainstream now. But when Ray was talking about this, in many ways, he was the first. He passed away in 2011, but his legacy lives on. He left everything to his two daughters, and his youngest daughter, Harriet, worked with the Georgia Department of Transportation and Georgia lawmakers to have 18 miles of Interstate I-85 in West Georgia, a major road in our state, to be named the Ray C. Anderson Memorial Highway. And since that time, 7 years ago, this space, this 18 miles, this corridor has become a real world testing ground, proving ground in the United States, and really a leader in the world to show on a public stage the technologies that can take us forward to really make this industry, this transportation sector, to really make it zero. And at the Ray, our goals are 0 deaths, 0 carbon, and 0 waste. And those are very lofty goals. But we believe the technologies are there or on their way and being developed, and we just need to leverage them and help policy and decision makers see this path forward. So as I mentioned, the Ray is an organization, and it's also a place. The Living Laboratory operates on a high-speed interstate. It's completely open to the public. And over the last 3 years, we've built a future-forward infrastructure. We've installed at least half a dozen new transportation technologies on and along a working interstate. We're able to do this through a partnership and a formal charter with the Federal Highway Administration in Washington, D.C., as well as the state of Georgia's Department of Transportation in Atlanta. We work with government partners through an expansion of P3, which is often talked about, but we say P4, public-private philanthropic partnership. We didn't invent that P4 idea, but we believe that this partnership enables philanthropy to help state DOTs try new technologies. In this sector, when we talk about government agencies and budgets that are using public monies, oftentimes it's a risky proposition. And so the job of the RAE is to mitigate those risks and enable state and federal governments to try new things, to innovate in transportation, in the real world, real projects, and to quickly scale these when they succeed within our proving ground. Again, here's an illustrative map of the 18-mile corridor that has many technologies in the road, on the side of the road. At the Welcome Center, we are excited to have the only solar paved highway. It's in the parking lot because it's not approved by the Federal Highway Administration yet, but it's the only example of this in North America. For example, a company in France has developed Wattway. And so at the RAE, you can see these technologies working in person, active research going on. So in getting ready for tonight's presentation, I was looking into more about Australia and where you all are located, having not been. And I was excited to see some similarities in the fact that, you know, Victoria is about 1.5 times bigger as a region than the state of Georgia. But, you know, relatively similar in terms of size and population. And diving in a little deeper to the city scale, where our corridor is located in that red box in Troup County is very much a rural area. Now we're working on a major road, but it is interesting to think about roadside landscapes in the context of their surrounding. And this is where the comparisons definitely end, because as you can see from population density, it's night and day compared to where you all are located. But I hope that these concepts, these ideas that we're working on here in Georgia will make you think about how you can make small but meaningful changes in this public right-of-way in your area. So I've broken the presentation into 3 sections in talking with the planners of the festival. We thought we'd start at a broad scale, an overarching idea of how we view roadside array, and then zoom in a little more on 2 specific research projects that have been ongoing here for the last 2 to 3 seasons. And I would like to leave plenty of time for questions. And when we transition between each of these sections, I'll pause. And if you have questions in the chat, we can try to talk about them then. We don't necessarily have to wait until the end, but hopefully there'll be time for that as well. I want this to be a discussion, and if something piques your interest, please type a question into the chat, and the team will help relay that for our conversation. So here's a nice photo of me farming the side of the highway. But in the United States, roadside landscapes don't always look that great. This postcard that I have in my personal collection on the upper right is touting the newly developed interstate highway in Pennsylvania. And I cannot think of more biologically dead landscape than those unvegetated slopes and that green strip right down the middle. So this first section of the presentation tonight really gets into what became my master's thesis at the University of Georgia. And for me, having the opportunity to work with the Ray and a professor here, Professor Davis, in specifically meadow making research, I started thinking more broadly about how we view this space. It's too often seen as a burden. It's not seen as a benefit. It's not seen as a productive opportunity. It's seen as a maintenance burden. But in many ways in my life, thinking about roadsides is something that, upon a little thought, is something I've been thinking about a long time. Growing up in Oklahoma, the middle of the United States, we often made very long road trips and spent lots of time driving the state highways and interstate highways in the United States. The lower photo is of bluebonnets. If you've ever had the chance to see photos online or hopefully visit in person in the spring in Texas, this is a unique sight of this bulb that comes up every year, but it's been an intentional planting. And so when I think about roads, who designed these roads? What's their history? What theories are used to design the landscape beside them? And it wasn't as straightforward as I thought it would be. I also want to start with this quote from a social geographer I really admire, J.B. Jackson. "A liking for this future of the human landscape of America, the roadside, should not blind anyone to its frequent depravity and confusion and dirt. Its potentialities for trouble, aesthetically, socially, economically, are as great as its potentialities for good. And indeed, it is this ambidexterity which gives the highway its margins so much significance and fascination. But how are we to tame this force unless we understand it and even develop a kind of love for it? We have not really tried to understand it as yet." And he wrote those words decades ago, but I would say that's still very true today. Most people travel down the road and aren't thinking about the space, the landscape on either side. So in the state of Georgia, there are 18,000 miles of state highway, over 1,200 miles of interstate highway. This moving image shows the daily commute into Atlanta. I can only imagine it's very similar to where you're located and the dense urban landscape of the Melbourne, Victoria, densely populated areas. But the number of workers who commuted here in the United States between 1960 and 2009 went from 41 million to 120 million per day. The love of roads, cars, has been a story richly deep in our culture here in America, and I would say for you as well in Australia. Books to movies, suburbs, strip malls. These landscapes are a large part of our culture in poetry, in books, in movies. Today, the current emphasis has changed from transportation and communication to now we're starting to take a step back and examine the use of these landscapes with stronger interest towards ecological impacts, creation of wildlife habitat, and increased human well-being. Roadside landscapes are more than just grass or trees. They're more than just billboards and way stations along the path. Roadside landscapes are an underutilized resource. By using more appropriate plant materials through ecological design and thoughtful maintenance practices, roadside landscapes can become a stimulus for broader acceptance of sustainable design in the built environment. And to circle back to the previous conversation about sharing this story with children, if these places that we travel along every day can be a part of that story, can be a space where they see this change. How much better is it? How much more rich of a conversation? You don't have to go to the rainforest. You can see an ecological, thoughtful landscape on your way to school. For me, again, this goes back almost 4 years now, but it's been an exciting ride looking into how we got to where we are today. I was excited that this gentleman here, who is the namesake for the landscape architecture program here at UGA, Hubert Bond Owens, he oversaw the development of roadside projects in the early 30s. Landscape architects used to play a major role. Here's a picture of some projects in Georgia back when it was called the Federal Bureau of Public Roads. You know, it's not a diverse planting, but it's not necessarily some of the problematic things I see today. There was attention given to this space. But sadly, over time, it seems to have changed. And so looking into the history of roads in the United States was an interesting study. I don't want to linger on that too much tonight, but in looking at roads and their history and the history of the design of the landscapes adjacent to them, what are some recommendations that we can make at the Ray? And what are examples of innovative things going on today? Surely we're not the only people interested in this, and we were. Again, going back to Texas, many people feel that you can't talk about roadside landscapes without mentioning Lady Bird Johnson. And I completely agree. The Highway Beautification Act of 1965 is a great place to start, where attention was given to what is happening in this space. Now, granted, the more I looked into this act, it had a lot to do with the number of signs, billboards that you see. There were no regulations, and traveling in the United States was a littered scene of any number of advertisements and car dumps and various things. It was kind of an unregulated space. And so the Beautification Act in many ways was intended to clean up that space, but it also had an ecological focus. Looking into literature, again, my thoughts about it being an underutilized resource were confirmed. There are federal and state policies that specifically talk about native plants. And since 1987 in the United States, every federally funded project is supposed to have 1% of its budget specifically used for native wildflower plantings. But in 1994, only 38 states had a programmatic level support for native wildflowers. So all that to say, there are good ideas out there, but there's more work to be done, and it needs to be more broadly accepted. So again, looking at innovative approaches to roadside landscapes, I wanted to take at the state level, just using that as a regional kind of broad framework. I'm sure there are many examples at the city level, but for this study, I kept it at the state level and reviewed 12 different projects in 18 states. And they fell into 4 broad categories of biofuel production, solar production, carbon sequestration, and habitat restoration. So with those projects, where do these projects happen? How do we know where they can rightfully land in our counties, in our state, in our city. What is the framework for decision making? That's where I found classification schemes. Here's one in Tennessee, and here's one in Washington State, looking at the space in the corridor and how you define it. Where is it appropriate for things to happen? Can it be this kind of bulleted bullseye list of thinking from, okay, in the urban core, we can do these things, in the suburbs, this, and rural, that, and then these landscape types? Or is it more what needs to happen in an operational standpoint right next to the road? Conservation sites, mitigation sites. And so this led me to develop our own typology at the Ray. And this is, for this study, it only gets into our 18 miles of corridor. I'm working to expand this so it can, there are other typologies than these 6, is what I mean to say. But the functional zones of operational environmental transition buffer, when you link them together with the 6 typologies, help us make decisions of where these innovative projects are appropriate to happen. Here again is the Ray. The red box is Troup County in West Georgia. I-85 here is the green line. And you can see the number of projects: right-of-way solar, bioswales, pollinator garden. And so we have these existing projects, and within the landscape lab, we have 3. 2 are online now. And again, we'll talk more in detail about both of the Kernza and the Meadow research. Here's another image of the corridor, and the pink ovals are places where these typologies exist: behind the guardrail, right-of-way, median, streams and wetlands, interchange, gateway. What does this typology mean? Here's an aerial with just a simple sketch over the top of the roadway. The main goal of a gateway is to showcase where you're at. What's your location? How can we help educate people to the work that is so important for climate change purposes? And there's no better way to do that than at a visitor information center. I'm sure there are similar places where traffic stops on major roads. People need to stretch their legs, get information, and it's an educational opportunity. Now, the 2 functional zones, the environmental and operational, are just showing that there are certain things you have to keep the roadway safe. That operational zone will always be required. It's a federal requirement that if you have a blown tire or you need to pull over, there's a designated clear zone. And so that operational zone, as I call it, will always need to be maintained in a somewhat traditional fashion of low vegetation, cleaning up the trash, and keeping it safe. But in this larger environmental zone, what more can we do? And, you know, again, this is where our wattway is located. You can see the solar panels in the road. And we're working to expand this gateway within our corridor at the Ray, because it's just the perfect place to have someone's attention to really tell the story of how important this work is and how it needs to expand. At an interchange, we could sometimes call them clover leaves, but you know, those on ramps, those off ramps, the bridge overpass, there's an embankment. And here again, I described this operational zone of strip mowing from 5 to 15 feet at a very low height, just for safety. in the operation, in the environmental zone, the pink zone, what more can you do? And that's where I think we've really only started to scratch the surface of what type of projects can happen. You know, pollinator discussions are increasing here in the United States. I would imagine they're important for you all as well. But in planting pollinators, seeds are very expensive. And so is there a way for us to plan for that and to plant native perennials with collecting their seed in mind, so that as a DOT, we can, as a department, we can produce the material we need to expand our program and thereby saving money, telling the story, etc. Can biodiesel crops be grown? I found examples of that in my state search of a state growing canola, harvesting it, and creating biodiesel that turned around and went right back into the state trucks. So again, creating that circular system. And then as carbon becomes more of the everyday conversation, how can this landscape be a part of that solution for sequestration? How can these landscapes be thought of in a way that makes them ideal to capture this carbon and hold it, and we can quantify that and we can scientifically prove that this is part of the solution. Other goals of hay production, production of fiber. Georgia is a state that produces a lot of paper, toilet paper, paper towels. There are a number of national companies that have large operations here. Can the roadside landscape be part of that conversation as well? And again, with this land, where is solar an opportunity? And even though we're at an interchange, which is the typology, within that typology, there is a condition of a guardrail. So behind the guardrail, that is the physical barrier that makes sure a car doesn't go down the steep cliff. Well, if this, or slope, if the slope is has a southern aspect and is a good opportunity for solar, why can't we put solar there if the space allows it? Again, just from a 10,000 foot view, looking at these corridors and just saying what more can be done. This is an asset that has been for too long forgotten. I don't know how it is for you all, but here I call it the bad golf course. It's just non-native turf that's mowed way too much. And it just goes on and on and on and on. And so taking this broader view of here is this land that we're not doing much with, but now in the face of climate change, how can we maximize our budgets, which from this state level are always a challenge. And then in the face of climate change, how can these really become an impactful solution? Looking at the median, oftentimes in the United States, when you have a divided fast highway, 70 miles per hour, there's a space in between that doesn't have a wall, doesn't have a barrier. It's vegetation. It might be a ditch, it might be a little mound. But again, just saying that's an environmental zone that we should be thinking more creatively about. Why can't that be that pollinator meadow? Now, maybe in the median, we don't want to invite the butterflies between the cars that are zooming by so quickly. But again, what if we planted it and we didn't mow it? What if we had a planting solution, an environmental solution that said, this space, its whole goal is carbon sequestration. And what that means is it's going to be tall grasses or trees. Trees are the best sequester of carbon. But for us in the United States, putting trees in between these lanes is problematic. It's unsafe if someone comes off at a high speed and the tree now becomes dangerous. But what if they're tall grasses? That's not dangerous to a car. But if you're managing the grasses in a way that you know scientifically is sequestering carbon. It's part of the solution. We quantify it, we monitor it, we study it. It's making the soil better. Why can't that space be used for more than just paying someone to cut the grass far too often? Again, here's just a simple description of that, of saying vegetation, it needs to be more thoughtful, is the overarching theme. The true right-of-way, the space to the right of the road, as we say here in the States, when oftentimes in our corridors, this area can be massive. I should have had a slide for this, but I was recently looking up, there's an estimate, and again, it's only an estimate, that 8 million acres of land is used for roads and the center line of the lanes. But there's an additional 10 million acres of adjacent lands that is this roadside landscape. What can we do with that 10 million acres in a way that's more than just the status quo of cutting the grass? Here's where I point out a researcher in the States, Joan Nassauer, who has this idea of orderly frames. We'll talk more when I get into the specifics of the meadow research. There's oftentimes a public perception that if it's tall and it's not cut, mowed grass, then something's wrong. No one's taking care of it. But Nassauer did some research and said, well, if you have this meadow that has grasses that are 12 to 36 inches tall, but you regularly cut a strip next to it, well, people can see that this orderly frame, that someone's been here. This is a thoughtful decision. We're not mowing the whole thing, but someone is taking care of the edge. And it helps maintain a positive public perception. Going on to the right-of-way, the buffer. This is one that really talks about the transition buffer zone. Just saying that, again, you're adjacent to private property, to commercial property, and just acknowledging that if you have a tall hay meadow, if you have a pollinator planting, if you have a carbon sequestration planting, that when you go to this transition of you're next to the land that is the public, private, commercial land, I recommended that we maintain that in a different way than the environmental zone. Again, behind the guardrail in the United States, and I assume it's the same for you, in certain situations, there are these physical strong barriers to keep cars from going in an unsafe place, but it creates an opportunity where trees can be planted. They are allowed by the Federal Highway Administration, but this is also a main place where solar can be, roadside solar can happen. And that's exactly what we did at the Ray. This photo on the right is our 1 megawatt solar array right next to the highway, the first roadside solar in Georgia and in the Southeast, I believe. But it's an exciting opportunity that has just for far too long not been taken advantage of. So I'll stop right there. It's been about 25 minutes or so before I go into Kernza. Does anyone have any questions about this broader idea about how we just view these spaces?
I think from a local, and thank you very much, Matthew, that was very insightful. I think from coming back to the city of Dandenong, maybe just talking about, for a lot of these projects, the first step of the process is obviously having the blueprint that the Ray has created over these 18 miles. But how do we kind of navigate working with kind of city councils and Department of Transport and car regulators or developers who are concerned that trees might fall on the road, or like how can we kind of start this conversation of using blueprints like the Ray and kind of be navigating that red tape per se in regards to actually implementing and being allowed to use I think it was 10 million potential square miles of land that's just around these actual roads. So I mean,
Yeah,
anything on that
it's
would
a
be
lot.
Yeah.
And I do think in the States, sometimes in our planning, we've like over planned, and having traveled in Europe and in Southeast Asia, roadside corridors don't have these, 100-foot setbacks, 200-foot setbacks that sometimes we do in the States. But still, it's an opportunity. And I think in Australia and the United States, it's in the public good. We've asked city, county, state, federal governments to manage these roads. There aren't private roads. Most countries, this is all the public realm, as we say.
Yeah.
So to your question about those hurdles, those bureaucratic policy hurdles, again, that's where we are excited, just as an organization, that P4, that public-private philanthropic partnership. And that all goes back to Ray. Ray was a businessman. Now, he was a leader in green commercial enterprises, but that's not how his story started. But he always believed that the private sector or the philanthropic sector would be pushing the government to do better. That too often, from a policy standpoint, even if you have an exciting new politician, thinker, the latest, greatest science coming out of university, far too often it gets watered down before it ever happens as an actual project on the ground. And so I would say finding partnerships is the way to overcome those barriers. If it's a community group, I'm trained as a horticulturist and an urban forester, and in previous jobs have planted hundreds of trees with just citizens who wanted more trees in their neighborhood, who wrote a grant, who got approval from the city, and mobilized to make a change in their neighborhood. Now, the same thing can happen in the broader infrastructure corridor. Just too often, as we're going about our busy lives, until I started this research 4 years ago, I wasn't thinking about all of this space, but it needs to be thought about, especially in the face of climate change. We talk about it here. It's a wicked problem. It is so hard to wrap your head around what needs. It's simple. We need to get carbon out of the air, but okay, how? And you need to reduce emissions, but who and where and when?
Or even
who's going to pay for it?
Even the CO2 versus carbon. I've worked in the space for many years with planting trees and getting people to draw down their emissions, but saying carbon credits is a bit confusing because 1 ton of CO2 equals 1 credit, and yet 1 ton of carbon is 3 tons of CO2. It's like things like that just baffle me, that why didn't we just stick with one, either CO2 or carbon, because they're not the same molecule, they're totally different. And so I think making it really simple. And I really love that you're coming from a horticulture perspective. We've actually planted 900 trees through Forever Fest, through the charity I manage up here in far north Queensland. So 100 each day of the 9-day festival, we're going to be planting 100 trees up here on a regeneration project we're managing. So really delighted that you're greening these areas. And I asked in the chat bar, I don't know if you saw, but are you excited by the greening possibilities under solar panels? And on that note, how many trees and meadow areas have been regenerated on this 18-mile stretch up to date?
Yes, and our solar is a pollinator-friendly solar. It's the first in the region, possibly first in the United States. There are a lot of people working on this. I'm not involved in that research just because of the nature of how our solar panel or our solar array happened. Again, through the bureaucracy. It took almost 4 years from, hey, we want to make this happen. Hey, we're a philanthropic organization. We'll put some skin in the game, but we need the state and the energy company to put some skin in the game. And it takes forever. But the energy company has the final say in all of that. But through our, relentless pressure, they are researching pollinator-friendly solar, and we definitely want to help tell that story. And in all of our solar projects, roadside solar projects. Again, yesterday there was a presentation about our new roadside solar tool and helping people across the United States realize the potential for roadside solar as a solution to our energy grid issues. And if we say we want all these electric vehicles, where's the power going to come from? Because we just don't have it in the United States. And I'm sure it's the same for many other places. But yes, so pollinator, habitat restoration is an important piece. And I've kind of glossed over, I tried to hit the high notes of that presentation, which was my thesis, which I finished last summer. But yes, roads and road making energy corridors are a leader in habitat fragmentation in the United States. And so viewing, okay, now the corridor's here, how can we do our best to make it better for ground nesting birds, to make it better for pollinators, for monarch butterflies are going to be endangered soon in the United States. So those are all conversations we're having. I'll go ahead and move on to this perennial wheat story and get to the some of the specifics of our meadow research since I don't want to run out of time, and we can have more conversation at the end. So one of the exciting projects at the Landscape Lab is working with this perennial wheat. Working with the Land Institute, which is an exciting organization based in Kansas, who is trying to turn industrial agriculture on its head and say, why does wheat have to be an annual crop? What if we can plant a wheatgrass once and maintain that field for forever? What are the carbon implications for that? They're huge. What are the input costs for that? They're huge. So they're trying to perennialize rice, sorghum, wheat, a few others. And we were able to, because the founder, Ray Anderson, was friends with the founder of the Land Institute, get our hands on this exciting plant. It was specifically named in a book called Drawdown 50 Projects to Save the World. But Kernza is the first crop coming out of the Land Institute. But Kernza wasn't grown to be planted on the side of the highway. Kernza was grown to be an agricultural solution. But what's exciting about it is these roots. Again, because it's a perennial crop, its ability to stabilize soils, to improve the health of soils is immense. But again, it was developed as a grain crop. And so currently, Patagonia makes a beer out of it. There's some bread that's being made, but it's still very much in the developmental stages. At the Ray, we just wanted to say, can this be part of the solution for how we view roadside landscape? And so here's our first, I call it Kernza 1.0, a modest 900 square foot, 30 by 30 row crop that I maintained for, or still maintaining it. And really all we wanted to see was, can this survive here? Can this be part of our solution in Georgia? And this weather data, this growth chart is all to say, yes, it survived. I would say it thrived. We're on our fourth season this year. That was planted in the fall of 2017. So 18, 19, 20, so 21. We're going to harvest coming up in July and send the grain back to Kansas to check its viability and its size and to see how it compares to the crops in Kansas, because we're much hotter, we're much drier. The soils at our site are terrible because it's a construction site. But here's this plant, this perennial grass, that could be part of the solution. This is just not an interesting, but you can see some of the weeds pressure around it. But it's just to say, ferns, I call it a celebrity plant because so much energy is being put into seeing how far it can go. And at the Ray, we're excited to be pushing it in a different direction than maybe the Land Institute didn't even think about initially, because it can be part of our plantings that help travelers become more comfortable with tall grass on the roadside. But we have a long way to go. We're only in the second phase of our research with Kernza. We're now looking into how to establish it. Planting it in rows and weeding it regularly is not sustainable at scale. We did this just to give it a fighting chance against the existing non-native grass competition around it. But we have planted some plots this spring, and we're going to let them fight it out, and we're going to see if they can thrive without intensive maintenance. So I just wanted to talk about ferns briefly, just because it's such an exciting opportunity, because Wes Jackson, who started the Land Institute, really was another innovator in thinking about solutions for climate change and how to do better. We can just do better. And so Kernza is the first major release from the Land Institute, and we're excited to be working with it at the Ray. I thought the audience might be interested in our perennial wildflower research. So I'm using some slides from Professor Davis and the current graduate assistant, Chris Roby, showing some of our preliminary results. This is the research that got me involved with the Ray. And our meadow research has to give credit to James Hitchmo from the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom, because we're very much using his method, but seeing if it works in Georgia. You might know his name. He's been a longtime researcher. He's a horticulturist and landscape designer. The book on the right, Sowing Beauty, is really an amazing book if you're interested in meadow making, aesthetic meadows, perennial wildflower meadows. He really tells you all that he's learned in his almost 2 decades worth of research. He really made a name for himself in the London Olympics. All of the meadows at Queen Elizabeth's Park were designed and installed by he and his partner in research. And it's a really unique method using a weed blanket. Behind him here, they're using sand, but you direct sow the seeds into this 2 to 3 inch layer of material, and your perennial desirable seeds get started in this blanket, and the blanket acts as a weed suppressor to the existing, often undesirable, more aggressive plants below it. So it allows these meadows to establish. Because oftentimes when you see meadows in the garden setting, they were planted by whole plants or plugs that have to be weeded and watered. And even though I have an extensive background in horticulture, I remind the team all the time, we're not garden making on the side of the highway. That's not sustainable. Gardens are beautiful. I'm a huge advocate for gardens and gardening, but at scale in these corridors, we're not going to be weeding and watering these. In many ways, these have to fend for themselves when it comes to nutrients and water. Now, as designers of this space, we need to think about how we can set this up to succeed. But we're not creating gardens. These are two of the well-known publications that Hitchmo has produced ahead of his book that really just show how the weed blanket, which is the lighter gray at the top, is successful. And circling back to Joan Nassauer, in these images, you can see her research where you have this orderly frame. And essentially, she found that if you have a messy ecosystem planting, a matrix of native grasses and flowers that on their own people might think is undesirable. If you have the orderly frame, the likelihood of public acceptance goes up. Again, here's a context map of the red line is I-85 as it cuts through, on its way from South Carolina on the right to Alabama on the left, and the star is where LaGrange and exit 6 is. Here's really where Landscape Lab does its work at exit 6. We have these various plots. The Kernza plots in purple, started as one of those squares, and we've expanded them this year in these 4 different meadow areas in different aspects of where the research is at. This is the first site. And again, we used granite fines, and so we had 3 different mixes and 2 different installation methods. So the side closest to the road was given the Hitchmo weed blanket method, and the clay side was just left bare, and the seeds were direct sown into native soil. Here you can see the granite fines, that gray kind of gravel, and on our planting day back in 2020, and then the native soil side. And through that first season, we clearly saw desirable flowering wildflowers in the granite fines. This is a native aster here in the middle, and one of the big performers from the first season is this red and yellow gaillardia, the Indian blanket, as we call it, blanket flower sometimes. And this is our monitoring 1 meter square, checking populations and counts of what's within that square. And so in the clay side, desirable plants were 14% in this particular plot, and the rest were undesirable. And in a photographic way, clay side is to the left on the left image. You can see this distinct line right in the middle of the image, and the weed blanket is on the right, and the native sown seed is on the left, and the same amount of seed was planted on either side. And you can just see how the native grasses, the grasses here are not native, they're aggressive, and they outcompete these perennial wildflowers. But within that 14%, we did learn interesting things about which species could stand their own, and that's where the gaillardia and the red and the verbena in the pale purple, the solidago, they were holding their own in that 14%. When you go to the fines, the weed blanket, the desirable, quadruples, 60-40 essentially. And again, here is just one example of the desirable, or the fine side, and the non-fine side. And within this, there's a much more diverse success of all. Our mix had 22 different species. We didn't see 22 species in the clay side, but in the fine side, the weed blanket side, we saw representatives of all the flowers we were looking for. So this is ongoing. We're now on the second season of phase 1, and those monitoring trips are happening now, and it's just getting better and better in the second season. And we've planted a second phase Now we're looking into this weed blanket material, and we've partnered with a contractor who is involved in this exciting terrace seeding, where they use compost and the seed is in the compost, and it's just directly blown onto the site, which has great ramifications for scaling up this work. And then just last week or 2 weeks ago, we saw monarch butterfly caterpillars at our site. And as I like to say, if you grow it, they will come. But if you're unfamiliar with the monarch in the United States, it's a beautiful species, and it has one plant that its caterpillar uses as a host. But as a species, it's quickly becoming endangered. And there's a lot of positive work being done around saving this pollinator. And I think I'm getting close on time. Can't help but show my two favorite cattle dogs, my buddies here, Jensen and Ekbo, and then all of our partners in this work in our corridor at the Ray. I'm not sure how we're on time, but I'll stop sharing and hope we can continue the conversation.
Too easy, mate. That's right on time, and yeah, just really exciting stuff. And I think Australia, we can really benefit from blueprints like the Ray that promote biodiversity, and have car parks that have solar panels as their tarmac, and yeah, so many parts. The electric vehicle component, obviously jobs, especially your graph comparing Melbourne to the area of Georgia you're in. It is fairly rural, and I think we need to encourage people, not just using the highways to go to the big cities, but we can create jobs in rural roadways, which I think keeps especially younger people in rural areas, which I think is a really important thing right now. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. And I'd love to hear, and you said a lot of hopeful things, but there's often quite a lot of negative news going on around the place, but what's something that you're kind of hopeful about leading into sort of 2030 and beyond that we're doing right?
I just find that people are interested in doing better. People are waking up to the needs of the climate, and these exciting conversations are happening about educating people who haven't been thinking about it, how to have conversations with people who don't believe exactly what you believe, but finding common ground. And so, at the Ray, we're really focused on highway infrastructure, energy production and transmission, because again, for us in the United States, these corridors have far too long been thought of as a burden and not as an asset. We spend $45 million a year cutting grass and picking up trash, and that's all they do. Now, in the grand scheme of the budget of the Department of Transportation, it's not that big. I mean, I believe it's close to $1 billion, because taking care of roads and bridges is expensive. Yeah. But $45 million is not a small amount of money. No. So how can you have a better plan to every year do a perennial sustainable project in this space that just is better? We can just do better. And so I'm just excited that these conversations are happening. If you would have told me I'd be talking to you all tonight, even 6 months ago, I wouldn't have believed you. But it's exciting to just share this information, and to see that people are interested in how we can all play a part in just supporting by being aware, but also, getting our hands in the dirt. We're trying to use community groups, school groups, safely. I mean, we're on a busy highway, but it's important work. And sometimes places that you never thought of, that little space between the curb and your sidewalk, why does it need to be grass? Why can't it be more productive? Why can't it tell a story that inspires someone to think about something better? So I'm just excited about the way the conversation is growing. It's like a snowball. I mean, we have to we have to wake up or the time's going to pass us by. But I feel like, at least in my circles, again, we're very much interested in it here at the Ray, but I find welcoming ears. So I'm hopeful for that.
Well, I think we're definitely keen to learn more, and I think the cross pollination between countries is really important, because, like you said, what worked in, I think it was Netherlands or wherever the blueprint was in Europe, that's obviously different to deploying that in Georgia, or I think it was England maybe, different to deploying it in Georgia, and what works in Georgia and England would be very different to what works in Australia. So I think the more we can kind of build out, especially ecosystem type models that are relevant to high rainfall tropical areas and desert areas and lowland forest areas, the more models we can build out that are relevant, I think it's going to be a big part. And I think Jane had a quick comment. Our park teams are working with the horticulture school, looking at drought resistant pollinator plants that will work with our climate and soil types. Also doing the biodiversity strategy, so much opportunity for our landscape design, parks and infrastructure teams to work together on a pilot project on a road verge, or even a park road verge as a first step. So there we go, a bit of direct feedback that you've G'd up some of the local council team down in Victoria. And Matthew, really just appreciate you staying up a bit later. I know it's probably been a very long day for you today, so we appreciate you staying up late for us out here in Australia, and really keen to be working with the Ray team ongoing. Your two colleagues yesterday were beyond insightful, and just really appreciate the energy to broadcast out. And I hope that we can contribute in one way or another to what you're creating out there.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. There was one other question about weeds I was going to address, wondering whether weeds can be used as plants in this context, again, using that language of weeds. And it's a great question. What we think of as a weed, my favorite definition of a weed is the wrong plant in the wrong place. You can have the most beautiful plant, but if it's in the wrong place, it's a weed. And so definitely thinking about what we define as a weed, because yes, in these harsh environments of the road verge or the roadside landscape, oftentimes those weeds thrive, and covering the ground, holding the soil with roots is what's important. And so thinking outside of the box of using clovers and other plants that are thought of as weeds is definitely something that I think about a lot. What is in this mix?
And what I can't remember exactly. It was the three sister combination that the Native American used with the legumes, the sunflowers, and either the wheat or barley.
Yeah, the three sisters. Yeah.
And could you just share a bit with that, because I think that's a really good example of what you just said.
Yeah, I'm talking about the three sisters in terms of if you plant a nitrogen fixing plant next to one that needs the nitrogen, next to a plant that uses the stalk of the corn to grow up, the beans grow up the corn. It's a trio of plantings that all support each other, which is something the Native Americans did well here when the Europeans arrived, and has often been talked about. But in thinking about our soils, yes, corn, squash, beans, thank you, Jessica. They all work together. And so thinking of our mixes, our planting solutions in that same way of how they can work together in terms of soil and aesthetics, and how they work together. So, but yeah, no, that's a great example. And what is a weed? It's a great conversation, because we have to change perceptions. Because people see this, and if they don't understand it, they'll complain, and next thing you know, your meadow gets mowed because somebody didn't like the way it looked. But
and really good job with being an innovator in the sense of having the pollinator friendly PV, and also innovating with some of your car park space being PV solar as well. Those are two hugely significant innovations, and I really hope that not just throughout stateside, the rest of the world can adopt both of those things, because they just make sense. Why build up big
Right.
spaces? Let's just use the tarmac that we had and create a road friendly PV that they can charge lampposts that are charging EV. It makes total sense. So yeah, really good job leading the way in that, and hope to see more flowers under solar panels soon.
Yes, no, we are too. We're very much advocating for more roadside solar, and it always should be pollinator friendly. There's really no reason why it shouldn't be.
Nice one, mate. Well, I appreciate that, Matthew, and thanks
Yes.
for the day today, and we'll sure to be in touch and share some of your news on social. And does the Ray have a hashtag that you like using?
Yes, we've been using Drive the Future.
There we go. We'll use that.
Hashtag Drive the Future. And we are at the Ray Highway on our social platforms.
Too easy, mate. Well, thank you very much, Matthew, and rest easy when you find it.
Will do. Thanks for having me.
No worries. See you, mate.